Let me begin by saying that I'm a man, and what gives me any standing for making comments about this verse? Well, I'm going to try my best, as kind of an outsider looking in. I may not be a woman myself, but I certainly am surrounded by several wonderful women in my life. This verse for certain strikes them in a much more personal way than it strikes me. So rather than imagining how they felt about it, I decided to ask them straight out. What do you think about this verse? I said. How does this verse make you feel? I asked my wife, I asked my daughters, family friends, my daughter's friends. Any Christian females I spent time with. They answered things like, it's horrible. I don't care for it. We are just as smart. What we lack in strength we make up in organization skills. I don't see why, just because you are stronger, you should rule over us. I'm sorry, but God is wrong about this. Their answers for sure were shocking, but I must say, not all that surprising. What was just as impactful was not just their words, but the emotions that stood out crystal clear behind them. Each of them felt very strongly about their responses. Then I turned the same question on myself. How do I feel about this verse? I had to admit, it makes me feel uncomfortable, inadequate. All this to say that this discussion is from a man's uncomfortable and inadequate position. Despite what we as men or women might feel about this verse, we can all agree that it has worked for thousands of years. Now, before you object, I can hear some of you objecting already. Hear me out. I am not talking about our actions, as such, but our conscience that guides our actions and screams at us when this is not the case. When Eve disobeyed God, two things happened to her that would affect all women after her. There was an emotional change as well as a physical change. At this point, I am not worried about the physical change, only the emotional one. Once again, the verse, Genesis 3:16, says, "And thy desire shall be to thy husband." In his wisdom, knowing all things, as he does, God knew what was coming. With this fall and this introduction of sin into the world, women would now face unspeakable violence. The sons and daughters of Adam and Eve would commit acts of violence against each other, as we continue to do to this day. Knowing this, God imprinted two different default responses to violence within men and women. In the story of the Garden of Eden, Eve shares the leadership role with Adam. But having the long view of history that he does, God realized that this sharing of leadership could become problematic in the face of violence. Therefore, God changed Eve's heart from that of a domineering, take-charge kind of woman, to a more agreeable, passive kind of woman. By doing this, women's default response to violence became one of submission rather than the impulse to fight back. I can hear you saying, wait a minute. That's not right. Lots of women fight back against violence. I am not saying that women never fight back as a response to violence. What I am saying is that their default response is one of passive submission. I can tell you still don't believe me. Well, let's look at one of the most current topics today regarding women and violence, the #MeToo movement. The underlying premise of the entire movement is that scores of women have for years reacted passively and submissively to male acts of violence. In the past they remained silent, scared and submissive in the face of sexual aggression. The only way this current situation is possible, is because the default response for women in these situations is to take a submissive posture. In trying to speak out, time and time again these women express how difficult it is for them to do so. It is difficult because it goes against their nature. Notice also that the remedy we have found does not primarily involve women fighting in the moment, which still goes against their nature. It works with this existing submissive impulse, allowing women to fight back in a social way that is consistent with their nature. Recent psychological studies bear this out. We usually talk about our possible default responses to danger or violence as fight or flight. But recent research suggests that this construct is more appropriate for men. The stress response alternative that women tend to face is tend or befriend. Do I need to take care of myself, tend, or do I need to try to make friends with this potential threat, befriend? In other words, at the garden, God replaced Eve's take-charge tendency with this much more submissive tend or befriend tendency. He imprinted it on her very DNA. I have posted a link to one of many studies on this for anyone interested in more on this topic. So, when I say that this has worked for thousands of years, I am not saying that violence against women has been good. This is the result of sin that entered our world at the garden and should never be celebrated. Violence exists, period. We just have to learn how to deal with it in our fallen world. But God in His wisdom and mercy needed a way to protect women in the face of violence. This was all the more important as another new reality stepped onto the scene after the fall: pregnancy and childbirth. Unlike men, Women are the ones who carry their babies within their own bodies for 9 months. An act of violence against a pregnant woman not only puts her at risk, but her child's life at risk as well. This default submissive response helps to protect children. The unborn child within a pregnant woman who fights an attacker is infinitely at more risk than an unborn child within a pregnant woman who submits to the attacker. Submission will in some cases cost the woman, and with it her unborn child, her life. But in most cases, submission will subject her to evil, but will also save her life and that of her unborn child. Now contrast that with the default response of a man. If an intruder breaks into a man's house, especially one where he has a pregnant wife or wife and child within the house, the default instinct within most men is to fight the intruder. You can ask the most scrawny, nerdy type husband or father about this. If an intruder entered your house that would threaten not only you but your wife, your unborn child, and your children, what would you do? To a man, I bet the response would be that I would fight to the death to protect them. Now this doesn't mean that when push comes to shove this is what each man would actually do. It is rather, what their base or default impulse would be. Submitting is a voluntary thing. Women look for a man that can be a leader in their life. A man they can trust and feel safe. God did not want women to suffer violence. He wanted women, and their children, to live through violence, in other words, to live and love another day.